Hello, everybody. So, for me, this set of chapters is Trollope at his finest. There is enough here for its own short novel, and much happens in both urban and rural landscapes, and perhaps especially internal ones. So I will try to do this justice, and you will see in a couple of minutes, I will get a little bit of professional help. And since there's so much to cover, I hope you'll forgive me for skipping over some of the plot developments. But first, a word about forgiveness. Trollope begins the entire novel telling us that Alice is the one we are to consider forgiving. But inspired by our last discussion, I would put forth that Trollope uses forgiveness as a major theme across the entire novel, and it is certainly palpable in today's chapters. Being able to forgive is a particular and worthy character trait. So perhaps the title is also questioning whether the characters in the novel, not just the men, can rise above prejudice and ego to understand the feelings and actions of those they love. Forgiveness can open doors. Its opposite, retained resentment, can close off opportunity, bringing sorrow and perhaps destruction. All right, so I'm not that good at sharing, but here we go. All right, so here's a quote from one of our chapters, chapter 64, The Rocks and Valleys, Mrs. Greenough. My belief is that a girl can have anything forgiven if only she'll tell it herself. And I thought what I would do is, through the lens of forgiveness, is go, not in the order of the chapters, but go to some of our locations. Vavasor Hall for the reading of the will, the Fells, Queen Anne Street, Park Lane, Queen Anne Street, back to Vavasor Hall. So maybe we'll look at this again at the end. And I'm going to stop share. Okay. So, as Ginny remarked last time, we ended the previous set of chapters with a cliffhanger. The squire at Vavasor had just died, and we were getting ready for the reading of the will, the opening of our current section. There was much tension about the will reading, and we learned that the feud between George and his grandfather, the squire, was given life after death. The squire disinherited George, declaring that the next squire should be George's son, or if he should have none, Kate's son, and Kate was otherwise nicely rewarded under the will. George and Kate discuss all of this on a walk on the Fells. Unlike the novel's prior walk on the Fells, this one took an ugly turn. George badgered and bullied Kate to try to tell him details about the squire changing the will, as George imagines a possible legal action. He suggests that Kate perjure herself. He was in a murderous rage, Trollope tells us, and Kate was afraid. And when she did not answer to his liking, he, quote, pushed her with great violence, so she fell heavily upon the stony ground. Kate's arm was badly injured, and later she told her aunt and others that she had fell. Trollope does show some insight into the dynamics of domestic violence, the self-blame, the covering up for an abuser. At the same time, Kate, in pain and holding her arm, does realize what has happened. So here is the great Timothy West describing from the narrator's perspective, Kate's state of mind. Okay, so.
As for love, all that we mean by love when we speak of it and write of it, a blow given by the defender to the defenseless crushes it all. A woman may forgive deceit, treachery, desertion, even the preference given to a rival. She may forgive them and forget them. But I do not think that a woman can forget a blow. And as for forgiveness, it is not the blow that she cannot forgive, but the meanness of spirit that made it possible.
So Kate reflects on how she gave up everything to support George and how that led to her to betray Alice. And George, what is he thinking after he leaves Kate so brutally on the Fells? Again, Timothy West.
George Vavasor was wretched as well as weary. and every step that he took, plodding through the mud, was a new misfortune to him. What are 5 miles of a walk to a young man, even though the rain be falling and the ways be dirty? What though they may come after some other 10 that he has already traversed on his feet? His sister Kate would have thought nothing of the distance, but George stopped on his way from time to time, leaning on the loose walls and cursing the misfortune that had brought him to such a pass. He cursed his grandfather, his uncle, his sister, his cousin, and himself. He cursed the place in which his forefather had lived, and he cursed the whole county. He cursed the rain and the wind and his town-made boots, which would not keep out the wet slush. He cursed the light as it faded and the darkness as it came. Over and over again, he cursed the will that had robbed him and the attorney that had made it. He cursed the mother that had borne him and the father that had left him poor. He thought of Scrooby and cursed him, thinking how that money would again be required of him by that stern agent. He cursed the House of Commons, which had cost him so much, and the greedy electors who would not send him there without his paying for it. He cursed John Grey as he thought of those £2,000 with double curses. He cursed this world and all worlds beyond, and thus, cursing everything, he made his way at last up to the inn at Shap.
Okay. I just feel that Timothy West's interpretation of this can just do more than words trying to explain it. Just, it's poetry. It's difficult, but it's poetry. So back at Vavasor Hall, John Vavasor and Aunt Greeno refer to George as the wild beast, and indeed he is. So let's jump ahead a bit so we can finish with George and move on to more pleasant parts of the plot. After all of this, George went back to London and sent a demanding letter to Alice through his supposed clerk, who pressured Alice to sign over some notes totaling £2,000 to pay his campaign agent, Mr. Scrooby. Trollope calls this letter, quote, unparalleled impudence. Alice reluctantly agrees to sign, but the notes would not be accepted in a timely manner. Again, we see George cursing everyone, including himself, this time on the streets of London. George, as he has in the past, engaged in fantasies of murder, but Trollope tells us he doesn't really want to murder anyone. Rather, quote, he gets some secret satisfaction in his mind dwelling on the subject, end quote. We can see how resentment eats at the soul. When John Vavasor, with his low emotional intelligence, I might add, learns that Alice signed the notes, he admonishes Alice about the money. And then he actually shames her. So let's see. Number 3. Okay.
On my word, I never heard of such a thing in my life, said Mr. Vavasor. I never did. £4,000 given away to such a man as that in 3 months. £4,000. And you say you do not intend to marry him? Certainly not. All that is over. And does he know that it is over? I suppose he does. You suppose so? Things of that sort are so often over with you. This was very cruel. Perhaps she had deserved the reproach, but still it was very cruel. The blow struck her with such force that she staggered under it. Tears came into her eyes, and she could hardly speak, lest she should betray herself by sobbing. I know that I have been...
Yep. Okay. A few chapters later, Trollope tells us that, quote, those cruel words of her father rang in her ears constantly. In the end, of course, John Grey puts up the money once again for George. Now, turning to much more pleasant parts of the plot, the Pallisers at breakfast. Trollope continues with the after effects of Lady Monk's party and brings us to Park Lane and the genteel home of Plantagenet and Glencora Palliser. Genteel, but not without some tension. This is a most memorable chapter, quite brilliant, really. We learned in the last set of chapters how Lady Glen returned from Mrs. Monk's party. She waltzed in front of the world with Burgo Fitzgerald, which led to Mrs. Marsham rushing to Park Lane to alert Plantagenet, who arrived post-haste to the party to bring Glencora home. Glencora, of course, knew she, by intuition, all of Mrs. Martian's doings, and she and her husband decided they would discuss this all at breakfast the next morning. After she was alone in the night, Glencora let down her guard and told herself that she loved Burgo despite all his bad traits and the disgrace she would bring upon herself if she went away with him. She did not love her husband, and he did not love her. This was the story she took with her as she went to bed. At breakfast, Plantagenet was deep into the morning paper and the possible cabinet shakeup. As to any shakeup in his marriage, he would be just as happy not to discuss. But Glencora, still with Burgo's letter in her pocket, insists they address the matter. As these types of conversations seem to go, they rehash the events of the evening, but soon turn to the state of their marriage. Glencora is feisty, sarcastic, witty, and very secure in her own narrative.
Do you know why Mrs. Marsham came here from Lady Monk's last night? Of course I do. She came to tell you that I was waltzing with Burgo Fitzgerald. You might as well ask me whether I knew why Mr. Bott was standing at all the doors glaring at me. I don't know anything about Mr. Bott. I know something about him, though, she said, again moving herself in her chair. I am speaking now of Mrs. Marsham. You should speak of them both together as they hunt in couples. Glencora, will you listen to me or will you not? If you say that you will not, I shall know what to do. I don't think you would, Plantagenet. And she nodded her little head at him as she spoke. I'm sure I don't know what you would do, but I will listen to you. Only, as I said before, it will be very nice when it's over. Mrs. Marsham came here not...
Plantagenet continues to explain how all the world watched her waltz recklessly. As the conversation proceeds, Glencora decides to tell all. Okay. 5.
Let me speak now, Plantagenet. It is better that I should tell you everything, and I will. I will tell you everything. Everything. I do love Burgo Fitzgerald. I do. How can I help loving him? Have I not loved him from the first? Before I had seen you, did you not know that it was so? I do love Burgo Fitzgerald. And when I went to Lady Monk's last night, I had almost made up my mind that I must tell him so, and that I must go away with him and hide myself. But when he came to speak to me, he has asked you to go with him then, said the husband, in whose bosom the poison was beginning to take effect, thereby showing that he was neither above nor below humanity.
Glencora continues that she should have never married Plantagenet and knows that she makes him unhappy because she hasn't given him an heir. It is all quite dramatic, and perhaps Plantagenet's staid personality serves him well here because he listens to her. And rather than a burst of anger, after all of this brutal honesty, Plantagenet seems to access a feeling he perhaps didn't know he had. 6. Sorry, I'm a little slow here, but it will be worth it.
Softly, slowly, very gradually, as though he were afraid of what he was doing, he put his arm round her waist. You are wrong in one thing, he said. I do love you. She shook her head, touching his breast with her hair as she did so. I do love you, he repeated. If you mean that I am not apt at telling you so, it is true, I know. My mind is running on other things. Yes, she said, your mind is running on other things. But I do love you. If you cannot love me, it is a great misfortune for us both, but we need not therefore be disgraced. As for that other thing of which you spoke, of our having as yet no child, and in saying this he pressed her somewhat closer with his arm, you allow yourself to think too much of it, much more of it than I do. I've made no complaints on that head, even within my own breast. I know what your thoughts are, Plantagenet. Believe me that you wrong my thoughts. Of course, I have been anxious, and have perhaps shown my anxiety by the struggle I've made to hide it. I have never told you what is false, Glencora. No, you are not false. I would rather have you for my wife, childless, if you will try to love me, than any other woman, though another might give me an heir. Will you try to love me?
Right? Anyone have a tear? Okay, so beautiful. Plantagenet is so committed to making this work that on the spot, he suggests they leave for an extended trip. Switzerland, Germany, and then Italy, and that Alice Vavasor could accompany them. It is a stunning moment. How could he, of all people, leave the Parliament? But cue the proverbial knock on the door. It is the butler to say that the Duke of St. Bungay is calling. As Plantagenet leaves Glencora to go to the Duke, Glencora reflects on what just happened at the breakfast table. Oh, sorry. Oh, I can't believe this. Okay, bear with me, it's worth it, otherwise I will skip it. Oh, okay, one more time. All right, it's frozen on my phone. So, I am no Timothy West, but I'm going to read it to you. Sorry about that. She had in truth told him everything, believing that in doing so, she was delivering her own death warrant as regarded her future position in his house. She had done this not hoping thereby for any escape, not with any purpose as regarded herself, but simply because deceit had been grievous to her and had become unendurable as soon as his words and manner had in them any feeling of kindness. But her confession had no sooner been made than her fault had been forgiven. She had told him that she did not love him. She had told him even that she had thought of leaving him. She had justified by her own words any treatment of his, however harsh, which he might choose to practice. But the result had been, the immediate result, that he had been more tender to her than she had ever remembered him to be before. Trollope tells us that Glencora is, quote, neither bold enough nor wicked enough, unquote, to leave her marriage. She was quite aware that he, her husband, had behaved to her with genuine, true nobility. And then Glencora ripped up Burgo's letter and threw it in the fire. Meanwhile, the Duke has come to say that their party wants to remove Mr. Finespun as Chancellor of the Exchequer and offers the position to Mr. Palliser. Extraordinary. This is his dream. He who stays up late night after night with his figures and still so young to be Chancellor of the Exchequer now. So his wife just told him that she doesn't love him, that she loves another man. He decides suddenly to embark on a trip to Europe to try to save his marriage, and now he is offered the position of Chancellor of the Exchequer. Quite a breakfast hour. In a surprising turn, Plantagenet ends up turning down the Duke. He is a man of his word, and unlike many previous nights in Park Lane, chooses Glencora over his political career. So here we have, as I had stated earlier, forgiveness and sacrifice and love. Glencora asks Alice to call on her and tells Alice the whole story of the return from Lady Monk's party and that poignant breakfast. We know that Trollope sometimes repeats scenes, since many of his novels, including this one, were originally published in installments. But here, a few chapters later, after dealing with some other plot matters, We get a replay of the whole story from Glencore's own words. Her tone is lighter and less troubled and somewhat endearing. I'm going to try this one.
She had in truth taken everything,
more
believing
time.
that
There, now it's working. Okay. So, okay, that was the last clip. Okay, so here's Cora retelling the whole story to Alice.
And when I told him that he might have another wife and child, he put his arm round me and whispered to me that he did not care so much about it as I had imagined. I felt more like loving him at that moment than I'd ever done before. He must be fit to be an angel. He's fit to be a cabinet minister, which I'm quite sure he'd like much better. And now you know everything. But no, there is one thing you don't know yet. When I tell you that, you'll want to make him an archangel or a prime minister. We'll go abroad, he said. And remember, this was his own proposition, made long before I was able to speak a word. We'll go abroad, and you shall get your cousin Alice to go with us. That touched me more than anything. Only think if he had proposed Mrs. Marsham.
Okay. So Glencore's voice is completely different, right? She's like a different person. And I love that Trollope repeated this scene in Glencore's own words as opposed to the narrator. First, it's such a wonderful turn in the plot and we get to read it again. And second, we see how Glencore has matured and softened and how she's actually changed her own story of her feelings toward her husband and their children. In an echo of the knock on the door to announce the Duke of St. Bungay from the breakfast, this retelling also ends in an unexpected visitor. This time it is Burgo Fitzgerald. Lady Glencore sees him for a few minutes and then calls for Alice to come into the room. She tells him she once loved him, but now she is another man's wife and he must go. Burgo tells Glencore she is hard and cruel, and Glencore says, "May God forgive you for saying that." Burgo leans over and kisses Glencore before leaving. Glencore, now committed to her marriage, still is not without some regret. All right, we will quickly return to Queen Anne Street, where John Vavasor, again lacking insight and sensitivity toward his daughter, invites John Grey to dinner. Alice is dismayed, but holds her head up and bears it all. I'm calling this forecasted forgiveness, because John Grey holds no grudges against Alice for breaking their engagement, and it's clear he plans to renew his marriage proposal when the timing is right. Not to mention that he is covering her payments to George without any guarantees that she will become his wife. John Grey tells Alice he will come find her in her travels abroad, and as Alice protests, he promises to give her notice before he does. This forgiveness takes a different tone in light of the patronizing attitude toward Alice. Finally, after such intense scenes, Trollope treats us to some humor. Back at Vavasor Hall, Captain Belfield arrives, and Mrs. Greenough finally agrees to marry him, on her own terms, of course. She asks the captain to fess up to his financial situation, and he does, sort of. Trollope tells us that, quote, Mrs. Greenough got much information out of him, and then, when she was satisfied that she had learned not exactly all the truth, but certain indications of the truth, she forgave him all his offenses. Soon Mr. Cheesacre arrives as well, but he is too late, although he had no chance in any event. In a very, very funny scene, Mr. Cheesacre declares that Belfield is wanted by the police, which causes Mrs. Greenough alarm. But when she learns it's only the sheriff who is after her husband-to-be, she is relieved, as sheriffs can be paid off. But later, she again asks the captain to explain. And we're going to have our final quote. And then I'm done because I know everybody wants to discuss. Okay.
For an hour before dinner, Captain Belfield was had into the drawing room and was talked to by his widow on matters of business, but he had, of course, known that this was necessary. She scolded him soundly about those sheriff's officers. Why had he not told her? As long as there's anything kept back, I won't have you, said she. I won't become your wife till I'm quite sure there's not a penny owing that is not shown in the list. Then I think he did tell her all, or nearly all. When all was counted, it was not so very much. 300 or 400 pounds would make him a new man. And what was such a sum as that to his wealthy widow? Indeed, for a woman wanting a husband of that sort, Captain Belfield was a safer venture than would be a man of higher standing among his creditors. It is true Belfield might have been a forger or a thief or a returned convict, but then his debts could not be large. Let him have done his best, he could not have obtained credit for £1,000, whereas no one could tell the liabilities of a gentleman of high standing. Ergo Fitzgerald was a gentleman of high standing, and his creditors would have swallowed up every shilling that Mrs. Greenough possessed. But with Captain Belfield, she was comparatively safe. Up on the...
Okay. All right. So thank you to Timothy West, and thank you to Karen Kleeman, who was kind enough to do a little tech run through with me yesterday. I wasn't sure this was going to work, but I'm very glad it did. So let's go back to the slides for 1 minute. Okay, so here we had some various turns about forgiveness: sacrifice and love, forgiveness forecasted, forgiveness and humor, kind of the ugly, counterside of forgiveness, violence, and also shaming. Okay, possible breakout topics: more about forgiveness and trust. One thing I didn't have time to go into was the trust that Mr. Palliser had for his wife, and some other issues of trust going on. And, I did choose to look at this through the lens of forgiveness, but this section has beautiful examples of female friendship. Kate and Alice, forgiveness there too, right? Kate and Aunt Greenough, and Alice and Cora. I'm calling her Cora because that's what Alice called her. And here's this great print sketch. Here, you can see it fuller here. And this is Captain Belfield. And here you have Mrs. Greenough and Kate in confidence. And I just think it's a lovely drawing of their I think they have a beautiful friendship as well. So that is, that's it.